got some things to say to you.
For the past 2 months, I've been watching a lot of my friends on Instagram making bread, which I'm super supportive about. Before becoming Chad the Filipino, I was Chad the Scientist. That was my thing. But one thing you may not have known about me, another potential option, was Chad the Baker. When I was still in San Francisco doing science research, I would bake bread every day. Baking bread to me is so scientific. It's basically like a science experiment where you have your hypothesis, your experiment, which is actually making the bread, and then your results, which is the product. And then from there, you basically just want to troubleshoot, and then you just want to figure out what part of the process can make your bread better. In my opinion, making bread is science. Because I don't bake sourdough in the Philippines, nor can I bake bread in South Korea. I basically searched through my whole Instagram archive history from the past 2 years to find a footage of me making bread. So today, I'm Chad the Baker. This will be the first video in many upcoming ones where I teach you how to make bread. I hope this is relevant to a lot of my friends on Instagram that are making bread. Shout out to all my friends at Hapag and all you other home bakers out there. Also, I want to say that there are so many different types of bread, such as like brioche, focaccia, pandesal, but in particular the one I'm going to be focusing on today is sourdough. And for the most part, most of these steps will apply to these other types of bread. I just want to say also that I was Chad the Baker, but I never worked at a bread bakery as much as I wanted to. But most of my training is from a bread book called Tartine Bread. And if you're not familiar with Tartine itself, they basically are the OG artisanal bread bakery in San Francisco. And anything after that was independent research or just second opinion from close chef friends I had that making bread is a journey. And from each experiment of making bread, you'll have more data to kind of analyze where you messed up. Step one, when you want to make your bread, is to make a starter. Starters are super interesting because even though they're only a mix of flour and water, say the flavor of your hands and environment really plays a huge impact on the flavor of your sourdough. No two starters are going to be the same. I'll post links on the comment section on how to get your starter started. Why is a starter important? Well, because starters have flavor and starters have the yeast, which causes your bread to rise. So the second step, making a levain. A levain is basically your starter, but instead of perpetuating itself as something you've saved, your levain is going to be baked and mixed into your bread. To make your levain, you want to mix your mature starter with some flour and water and ferment it either the night before or early on in the day that you intend on making bread. This is important because your levain is what makes bread rise. Step 3 is what we call the AUTOLYSE. What you want to do is mix flour and water together. At this point, this is where your actual bread will come from. This step is important because one, it allows the water to draw out all the starch and sugars from, all the flour together. And two, the hydration allows the starch molecules to come together and connect gluten networks together, which is what gives bread its structure. This part will take anywhere from between 30 minutes to 1 hour, just so that all the starch and sugars and gluten is interconnected together. One thing that you may be considering is hydration. In the future, I'll make a video about this particular aspect because as bakers, we kind of lust after the idea of having really high hydration doughs. A high hydration dough does not necessarily mean good bread. What high hydration does basically is it gives you more chewy, fluffy bread, less dense and potentially more airy. But on the downside, it's very difficult to handle properly. So if you're making bread for the first time, stick to low hydration doughs, anywhere from 60 to 70% of total bread volume relative to flour. Step 4, after you wait it anywhere from between 30 minutes to 1 hour, this is where you mix in your salt and your levain. A trick that I use and maybe a lot of other bakers use is I reserve a small amount of water on the side that I mix my salt into. If you are to mix salt itself, it's not going to distribute evenly among the bread. However, if you dissolve salt in water first, you have a saline solution that will then be mixed more evenly. After that, you can then mix in your levain, which is where the flavor will come from. So I just added my starter, and I'm just mixing it all together now. Thank you, bread mixer. Thank you, KitchenAid. Not sponsored though. This is where the real fun starts because becoming more intimate and kind of building your baker's intuition on how to make bread, which is what I find to be very meditative about tactile processes. I was Chad the Baker, but I was also Chad the pasta maker. My ex-girlfriend for Christmas one year got me a pasta maker and I was making so much pasta. I was making ravioli and like fettuccine. Like that's a different rabbit hole. I'll make like a video on that some other time. Pasta's lit. So is bread too, but back to bread. So this is step 5, and this is the bulk fermentation, which I think is the second most important step in the whole bread making process. Basically what you're doing is letting the levain really integrate and mix into your bread and give it flavor. This is also where you kind of give your bread preliminary structure, break it down for you. Your levain is composed of bacteria. How it works is that these lactobacillus yeast bacteria will ferment starch into alcohols. One of the byproducts of this fermentation is carbon dioxide, which is how you get all those air bubbles. And this is the important part because this is how you get a fluffy, moist crumb with lots of like holes and texture, but also where you get your flavor too. During this bulk fermentation process, you're gonna be doing what we call folds. It is essential because it gives bread structure. The method that I learned from Tartine Bakery, and is kind of more easy and lazy to be honest, allows you to do your bulk fermentation inside the bowl.
So every like 30 minutes or so for 2 hours, you want to mix your bread so that you build surface tension and structure. Hopefully get like a good rise in your bread.
As the yeast will ferment, release a lot of carbon dioxide, you need structure so that air doesn't collapse and just like escape. Bulk fermentations can last anywhere between 2 to 3 hours. The amount of folds you do really depends. Ideally, you want to do more folds in the beginning, and then after 2 hours, you do less folds, just to keep it like very general. If you don't have access to Tartine Bakery, I will put the resources that I use down below. So step 6 is the shaping part, which I think is the hardest part, just because this is where you really reinforce that bread structure that I personally did all of my shaping inside the bowl because I'm lazy and I didn't really want to clean up the dough remnants on like my counter. Have some flour on the side, flour your counter, dump your bread onto your counter, and then you just want to do a series of shaping where you like fold it on each other, fold it again on the top, fold it again on the bottom, and then flip it upside down and then roll it and kind of just like massage it. It should be like a chubby baby Play-Doh. And then if you have a banneton, which is like one of those weaved wooden baskets inside your banneton, and at this point you can either let it proof again, or you can do what I normally do and do final retarded proofing. Retard and retard are 2 different things, by the way. If you are pinched for time, or you kind of want to let more flavors develop, put the bread in your fridge and it will kind of retard the fermentation process, and you can then just bake it off the next day. Final step, baking it. So people will recommend baking it in either a cast iron or Dutch oven. You do you. You want to preheat whatever device you're using, because when you first add your bread, that's what it's gonna sizzle, and that's what's gonna give you like your thick bottom crust. For this baking process, you basically start from a very high heat, around 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and then after 20-30 minutes, drop it down to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 350. So at the high temperature, you actually want to have your bread covered, but at the second step, you want to remove the lid you have. Why this is because in the first part, you're kind of steaming the bread to help give it more oven spring. This is basically what's going to give you like that rise to help you get like a really tall bread. Otherwise, it might be like flat and more wide than it is tall. Oh, but also by the way, like scoring is like another important thing. That's like kind of where you can like flex your creativity. I don't really care about, I'm just trying to eat the bread. Scoring is important because you basically just like slit the top of your bread at an angle, and this helps release air from the boule so that it can rise better, ideally. And then so going back to part 2 of the baking process, you remove the lid because after you get the oven spring, you now want to kind of caramelize the sugars on the top of your loaf, and this is what's going to help you give you that beautiful crust. This is kind of where you can play around with it depending on your results. But if you want like a thicker crust, maybe try steaming it for less time and then baking it at a higher heat, uncovered, so that you have more direct oven heat to kind of caramelize and cook the sugars on the top of your bread. And the final step is, after it's done baking, let your bread rest down, because although the interior of bread is done cooking, the actual bread interior is still very moist and soft. And so by allowing your bread to rest, you kind of give it time to allow the gluten and bread interior to stabilize and connect with itself. Resist all temptation. I know first-hand experience, eating freshly baked bread is one of the best pleasures of life, especially with like some olive oil or butter. I would like literally up half a loaf. I ate so much bread. But anyway, this is basically the whole gist of how to make bread, but I hope these Instagram videos I have from my archives can help you. If you're looking for anything more in particular, I'll make more videos on how to make bread in the future. So once this whole Corona thing is over, like hit me up in my DMs if you need any particular help in the comment box. Definitely will provide some resources for people who are interested in baking, get them more confident or more knowledgeable about how to make bread. This is Chad the Baker, Duck and Soul, signing out. Have fun making sourdough, because it's honestly so fun. It's a journey, but it's worth it in my opinion because you really build some patience and learn more about yourself. But also when you see the difference between like your first ever bread loaf versus like whichever one you think is like your first perfect one, you're gonna feel very proud of yourself. And then also on the right side, with all this bread, you can make sandwiches. And then also begin to delve into making other kinds of bread too, like brioche, which is like my other thing. I love brioche so much. It's so bad for you, but it's also so good. So